Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about healing from trauma. It was about the final stage of the empath after narcissistic abuse, and why this transformation either destroys them completely or creates something psychologically unprecedented. In his clinical practice, Jung documented empaths who had survived systematic narcissistic manipulation and reached what he called the final stage of empathic development, individuals who had undergone complete psychological metamorphosis. These weren't typical recovery stories, but cases where empaths emerged with what Jung termed integrated shadow consciousness and immunity to all forms of manipulation. Jung called this discovery dangerous because empaths who reached this final stage often became unrecognizable to those who knew them before. They had developed what he described as sovereign empathy, the ability to feel deeply while remaining psychologically untouchable, creating a level of consciousness Jung had rarely encountered. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most dangerous discovery about the final stage of the empath after narcissistic abuse, and why he believed this devastating experience either annihilates empathic sensitivity forever or transforms it into what he called the archetypal wounded healer, a form of consciousness that transcends both victim and survivor. The case that revealed this phenomenon began in 1928 with a patient Jung described in his private notes only as M, a 34-year-old woman whose empathic gifts had attracted a series of increasingly destructive narcissistic partners. When she first came to Jung, she was what he called psychically dissolved, her sense of self so completely eroded that she could barely distinguish her emotions from those around her. But Jung documented something extraordinary over the following 2 years. M didn't simply recover. She underwent what Jung described as alchemical transformation through shadow integration. Where once she had been permeable to every emotional current, she developed what Jung called conscious permeability, the ability to choose exactly what to absorb and what to deflect. Jung wrote in his notes, "M has achieved something I previously thought impossible, complete empathic sovereignty. She can feel the depths of another's pain without drowning in it. She can detect deception with supernatural accuracy. Most remarkably, she has become immune to manipulation while retaining her capacity for genuine compassion." The transformation was so complete that Jung questioned whether M was still the same person. Her family noticed the change immediately. Where once she had been the family's emotional caretaker, she now set boundaries that seemed unbreakable. Former friends accused her of becoming cold or different, but Jung recognized something profound. M had reached the final stage of empathic development that he had only theorized was possible. Jung observed that M's eyes had changed. "They hold depths I've never seen," he wrote, "as if she has gazed into the abyss of human nature and emerged not broken, but wise." Jung realized that narcissistic abuse creates what he termed the empathic crucible, a psychological pressure cooker that either destroys empathic entirely or forges it into something far more refined and powerful. The key lies in understanding what Jung called shadow integration through forced individuation. During narcissistic abuse, the empath is systematically forced to confront their own shadow, the parts of themselves they've disowned or rejected. The narcissist, Jung observed, acts as an unconscious shadow mirror, reflecting back the empath's own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and emotional detachment. Jung documented that empaths typically go through what he called the 3 deaths during this process. First, the death of their idealized self-image as purely good and giving. Second, the death of their belief that love can heal anyone. Third, and most crucially, the death of their need for external validation to feel worthy. The empath must face their own shadow, Jung wrote, not through gentle introspection, but through brutal confrontation with their own capacity for darkness. The narcissist, unknowingly, becomes the catalyst for this essential psychological work. Jung identified that empaths who survive this crucible develop what he called integrated empathy, the ability to feel without fixing, to understand without taking responsibility, and to love without losing themselves. This isn't emotional numbness, but rather emotional mastery. The neurological changes Jung observed were profound. These empaths retained their sensitivity, but gained what he described as conscious filtering capacity. They could sense everything, but choose what to process. Jung noted this was similar to advanced meditation masters, but achieved through trauma rather than spiritual practice. Jung wrote, "The narcissist, in their unconscious role as shadow teacher, forces the empath to develop psychological muscles they never knew they possessed." But Jung discovered something that disturbed him deeply about empaths who reached this final stage. They often became isolated not by choice, but by necessity. The very transformation that made them psychologically powerful also made them fundamentally incompatible with unconscious people. Jung documented that these evolved empaths could no longer tolerate what he called psychological unconsciousness in others. They could instantly detect when someone was operating from ego, projection, or manipulation. This created what Jung termed the consciousness gap, an unbridgeable divide between those who had integrated their shadow and those who remained unconscious of it. Jung's patient described this phenomenon. "It's as if I can see the psychological machinery of everyone around me, their defenses, their projections, their hidden motivations. It's all transparent now. But this clarity has cost me almost every relationship I had." Jung realized this was the hidden danger of empathic evolution. These individuals had developed what he called archetypal sight, the ability to see past personas and into the deeper psychological patterns driving human behavior. While this made them incredibly powerful healers and guides, it also made ordinary social interaction nearly impossible. Jung wrote, "They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like Adam and Eve, they can never return to the garden of unconscious innocence." The most disturbing aspect was that many people instinctively feared these evolved empaths. Jung noted that others could sense, even unconsciously, that these individuals could see through their psychological defenses. This created what Jung called the prophet's isolation, being rejected not for being wrong, but for seeing too clearly. Jung documented cases where families, friends, and even other therapists became uncomfortable around these individuals, sensing their piercing psychological insight without understanding what they were responding to. Through his extensive case studies, Jung identified 4 distinct pathways empaths take after narcissistic abuse, with only one leading to the final stage of development. Type 1. The dissolved empath. These empaths never recover their sense of self. Jung observed they become psychic ghosts, present but not truly alive. They've lost the ability to distinguish their emotions from others and live in a constant state of emotional chaos. Jung noted these empaths often develop what he called perpetual victim consciousness, repeatedly attracting similar abusive dynamics. Type 2. The armored empath. These empaths protect themselves by shutting down their empathic abilities entirely. Jung described them as having built psychological fortresses around their hearts. While they avoid further abuse, they also lose access to their gift entirely. Jung noted they often become cynical and emotionally disconnected, essentially choosing safety over authenticity. Type 3. The wounded healer. These empaths transform their trauma into a mission to help others. While admirable, Jung warned this type often remains trapped in what he called compulsive rescue patterns. They've learned to set boundaries, but still derive their worth from being needed. Jung observed they haven't fully integrated their shadow and remain vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. Type 4. The sovereign empath. This is Jung's final stage, empaths who have achieved complete integration of their empathic gifts with their shadow elements. Jung wrote, They have become what I can only describe as conscious vessels, able to hold the full spectrum of human experience without being corrupted or depleted by it. Jung identified specific characteristics of sovereign empaths. They can feel others' emotions without taking responsibility for them. They detect manipulation instantly, but respond with compassion rather than anger. They maintain boundaries without walls, and they've developed what Jung called archetypal wisdom, understanding human behavior at the deepest psychological levels. The key difference, Jung noted, is that sovereign empaths have fully embraced their own shadow. They no longer project their disowned darkness onto others, making them immune to the psychological hooks that narcissists use. Jung documented several dangers inherent in reaching the final stage of empathic development that made him question whether this evolution was worth the cost. The isolation factor. Jung observed that sovereign empaths often lived in profound isolation. They have outgrown the psychological level of most humans, he wrote. Like adults trying to relate to children, the gap in consciousness creates an unbridgeable divide. Many reported feeling like aliens in their own families and communities. The burden of sight. These empaths could no longer unsee the psychological patterns driving human behavior. Jung noted they often experienced what he called archetypal fatigue, exhaustion from constantly witnessing the same unconscious patterns playing out in human relationships. They could predict relationship failures, see through political manipulation, and detect emotional patterns years before they manifested. The responsibility weight Jung documented that many sovereign empaths felt burdened by their abilities. They could see solutions to others' problems, but knew that unsolicited insight is rarely welcomed. This created what Jung called the Cassandra complex, having accurate psychological insights that others reject or cannot understand. The authenticity demand. Perhaps most challenging, Jung observed that these empaths could no longer tolerate inauthenticity in themselves or others. They had become what he called truth sensors, immediately detecting when someone was being false or manipulative. This made maintaining social relationships extremely difficult. Jung wrote, "They have achieved psychological mastery, but at the cost of normal human connection. They have become bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms, but bridges are walked upon, not embraced." The most dangerous aspect Jung identified was what he called archetypal possession. Some empaths became so identified with their role as healers or truth-tellers that they lost touch with their humanity. Jung developed what he called the shadow integration protocol, specifically for empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse. This wasn't traditional therapy, but what he described as psychological alchemy, transforming the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. Jung insisted empaths must first acknowledge their own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and cruelty. "You cannot integrate what you refuse to own," he wrote. This involves recognizing how their empathic gifts may have been used to control others, how their victimhood may have been weaponized, and how their goodness may have been a mask for deeper psychological needs. Stage 2. Projection withdrawal. Jung taught empaths to systematically withdraw their projections from the narcissist. This means recognizing that the narcissist's grandiosity reflected their own disowned desire for recognition, that the narcissist's manipulation reflected their own subtle controlling behaviors, and that the narcissist's lack of empathy reflected their own hidden emotional numbness. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Rather than building walls, Jung taught what he called conscious permeability, the ability to choose moment by moment what to absorb and what to deflect. This involves developing what Jung termed empathic discernment, feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, and loving without losing oneself. Stage 4. Archetypal alignment. Jung believed the final stage involved aligning with what he called the wounded healer archetype, accepting that their suffering had prepared them for a specific role in the collective unconscious. This isn't about becoming a professional healer, but about embodying the integration of wisdom and compassion that Jung believed was essential for human evolution. Jung wrote specific practices for each stage, including what he called shadow dialoguing, consciously conversing with the parts of themselves they'd disowned, empathic fasting, deliberately choosing periods of emotional non-absorption, and archetypal meditation, connecting with the deeper patterns that govern human behavior. The key insight Jung emphasized was that empaths must stop trying to return to who they were before the abuse. The chrysalis cannot become a caterpillar again, he wrote. The goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis. Jung studied historical figures to understand what determined whether empathic individuals achieved sovereign consciousness or were destroyed by their sensitivity. His analysis revealed patterns that applied directly to modern narcissistic abuse recovery. Success pattern. Carl Jung himself. Jung revealed in his private writings that his own psychological theories emerged from surviving what he called psychological persecution by authority figures who tried to manipulate his empathic nature. Jung wrote, "My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers, forcing me to develop the psychological tools that would become my life's work." Jung achieved sovereign empathy by refusing to become bitter, by studying his tormentors as psychological specimens rather than personal enemies, and by transforming his insights into service for others. His method became the template for empathic integration. Success pattern. Historically documented cases. Jung documented several patients who achieved similar integration. 1. A composer who survived an abusive marriage channeled her trauma into music that Jung described as archetypal, speaking directly to the collective unconscious. Another, a physician, developed unprecedented diagnostic abilities after surviving psychological manipulation by colleagues. The common thread Jung identified was their ability to see their abuse as initiation rather than victimization. They understood their experience as preparation for a larger purpose rather than random cruelty. Failure pattern. The gifted who didn't integrate. Jung also studied historical empaths who were destroyed by their sensitivity. He noted they typically fell into one of two traps. Either they remained identified as victims, using their trauma as their primary identity, or they became what Jung called wounded wounders, using their psychological insights to manipulate and control others. Jung wrote, "The difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath is not the severity of their trauma, but their willingness to transform poison into medicine." The failure pattern always involved what Jung called shadow rejection, refusing to acknowledge their own capacity for the very behaviors that had wounded them. Jung recognized that sovereign empaths needed entirely different types of relationships than typical empaths. He developed what he called consciousness compatibility theory to help them find authentic connections. Recognition signals. Jung identified other evolved empaths could be recognized by their ability to discuss psychology without becoming defensive, their comfort with paradox and contradiction, their lack of need to be right or superior, and what Jung called archetypal humor, the ability to find lightness in the darkest human patterns. Safe relationship. Characteristics. Jung noted that healthy relationships for sovereign empaths involved mutual respect for psychological boundaries, comfortable silence without need to fill space with chatter, ability to discuss shadow aspects without judgment, and what Jung termed conscious intimacy, connection based on authentic self-revelation rather than projection. Community-building strategies. Jung recommended that sovereign empaths seek others who had undergone similar transformative experiences, not necessarily narcissistic abuse, but any experience that forced rapid psychological evolution. He noted that trauma survivors, spiritual seekers who had faced their shadow, and individuals who had survived major life transitions often made compatible companions. Jung warned against trying to maintain relationships with unconscious individuals out of guilt or obligation. "The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar," he wrote. "Attempting to do so serves no one and dishonors the transformation." He also recommended what he called archetypal service, using their evolved empathic abilities to serve the collective unconscious through teaching, healing, creating, or simply modeling integrated consciousness. Jung documented that the transformation from wounded empath to sovereign empath follows what he called the 5 metamorphoses, each marked by specific psychological shifts and challenges. Metamorphosis. 1. The dissolution. This occurs during active abuse, when the empath's previous identity completely breaks down. Jung noted, this feels like psychological death, but is actually ego dissolution preparing for rebirth. The empath experiences what Jung called blessed disintegration, the destruction of false self-concepts. Metamorphosis. 2. The descent post-abuse. The empath enters what Jung termed voluntary underworld journey. They must face their own shadow, acknowledge their participation in the dynamic, and confront their deepest fears about their worth and lovability. Jung noted this stage often involves what appears to be depression, but is actually psychological composting. Metamorphosis. 3. The integration. The empath begins consciously choosing which aspects of their shadow to embrace and which to transform. Jung called this selective shadow incorporation. They develop the ability to feel their anger without becoming cruel, acknowledge their selfishness without becoming narcissistic, and own their power without becoming manipulative. Metamorphosis. 4. The emergence. The empathic abilities return, but in refined form. Jung documented that empaths at this stage could feel others' emotions, but weren't compelled to fix them, could detect manipulation, but responded with compassion rather than anger, and could love deeply without losing their center. Metamorphosis 5. The sovereignty. The final stage Jung observed was the development of what he called archetypal consciousness, the ability to see beyond individual psychology to the larger patterns governing human behavior. These empaths had become what Jung termed conscious bridges between the personal and transpersonal realms. Jung noted that each metamorphosis typically took 6 to 18 months, with the entire process requiring 3 to 7 years of conscious work. However, he emphasized that the timeline varied greatly based on the individual's willingness to face their shadow and their commitment to integration rather than just healing. Jung identified several specific traps that could derail empaths during their transformation, warning that avoiding these pitfalls was crucial for achieving true sovereignty. The spiritual superiority trap. Jung warned that some empaths, after glimpsing their evolved abilities, became what he called spiritually grandiose, believing their trauma made them more enlightened than others. True sovereignty includes profound humility, Jung wrote. The moment one believes they are beyond shadow, they are possessed by it. The perpetual healing trap. Some empaths became addicted to transformation itself, constantly seeking new healing modalities rather than integrating their gains. Jung called this therapeutic materialism, treating healing as consumption rather than embodiment. The isolation addiction trap. While some isolation was necessary for integration, Jung warned against using psychological evolution as an excuse for avoiding all human connection. The sovereign empath serves consciousness through engagement, not withdrawal, he noted. The revenge trap. Jung observed that some empaths used their evolved psychological insights to subtly manipulate or punish those who had hurt them. True integration transforms the desire for revenge into compassion for the unconscious, he wrote. The maintenance practice Jung recommended was what he called daily shadow check-ins, regularly examining their motivations, projections, and emotional reactions to ensure they remained conscious of their psychological processes. Jung's final insight about sovereign empaths was perhaps his most profound. He believed they represented an evolutionary leap in human consciousness, essential for humanity's psychological development. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, has become what I believe represents the next stage of human evolution. Individuals capable of feeling the full spectrum of human experience while remaining centered in their own truth. They are the bridge between ego consciousness and self-realization. Jung believed that as humanity faced increasing psychological complexity, these evolved empaths would serve as consciousness midwives, helping others navigate their own shadow integration and empathic development. He saw them as essential for healing the collective trauma that humanity carries. Their suffering was not personal, Jung concluded, but archetypal. They have endured the collective human experience of abuse and emerged with the medicine our species needs for its next evolutionary step. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse and reaches Jung's final stage has undergone what he called the ultimate individuation, becoming fully themselves while serving something larger than themselves. Jung's most dangerous discovery revealed that the deepest wounds, when properly integrated, become humanity's greatest gifts. The sovereign empath stands as proof that consciousness can emerge from catastrophe, that wisdom can be forged from suffering, and that the very experiences that seem designed to destroy us may actually be designed to transform us. As Jung wrote in his final notes on this phenomenon, the narcissist, unknowingly, serves as the dark priest of the empath's initiation. Through their cruelty, they forge the very consciousness that will ultimately heal what they represent. Your journey through narcissistic abuse, if you allow it, can become your initiation into sovereign empathy, not despite your suffering, but because of it. CTA. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of empathic evolution, comment, "I am becoming sovereign." Your transformation serves not just your healing, but humanity's evolution. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.